Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Finding Freedom. In this lesson, video, we're going to talk about how to stay creative with myth and legend as your tools, right? If you've been paying attention to class, the last lesson that I uploaded was talking about resources, tools, and supplies. Now, when I grew up, I was fascinated by different myths and legends, everything from Merlin to the Bible to, the immortal life of Nicholas Flamel, which I mentioned a couple times. Then you have King Arthur, and then you have what else? Jack and the Beanstalk, Pete. What is it? Pete and the Dragon. What is it? That's a Disney movie. Bedknobs and Broomsticks. The Sound of Music, and all these things, right? And so I would take some of these and I would look at them and I would realize that some of these myths and some of these legends actually hold some truth to them, right? But you could also learn lessons from them. For instance, in Merlin, which I just went back and I looked at it not too long ago, I was wondering because, a lot of people thought Merlin was single, this, that, and the third. In some tales, it said that the Lady of the Lake was his daughter, but then other tales, it would say that it was his mistress or his significant other. But she was also known by the name of Nimue. I think that's how you pronounce the name, Nimue, if I remember correctly. But she also went by Vivian. Now, Vivian actually was an enchantress, so on and so forth, meaning she worked with charms, tarot cards, oracle cards, or whatever the case may be, and she put spells on things, so on and so forth. Well, over time, she ended up imprisoning Merlin, so on and so forth, according to folklore. Now, this is very interesting because, yes, we live in a world that is very, diverse with things like Harry Potter, and then we have politics, right? But then if you look at Harry Potter and the house system, you could go to Harvard and they work off of a house system, right? So you could see the similarities between the two, right? If you went to Hogwarts, it was a prestigious school for magical arts. If you go to Harvard, it's a prestigious school for education. So there are some lessons and similarities to things that we hear and we see, so on and so forth. So how does this help you become a better storyteller, a better presenter, so on and so forth, right? Or a better person in life? Well, if you look at these stories, whether it's fact, fiction, fictional, whatever the case may be, you can learn from these things. For instance, Merlin. Merlin ended up falling in love with Vivian, and over time, she actually was trying to learn his secrets, right? She would say stuff like, well, why do I got to do this when I have you, so on and so forth, right? And then what happened was Merlin ended up, and according to folklore, ended up in a type of depression that he was put into on purpose, right? Similar to Edgar Allan Poe. The only way they got great work out of Edgar Allan Poe was when he was feeling sorrowful, right? Or feeling depressed. And then you have The Raven and so on and so forth that came from his great literature works. And this was a real person. Now, Merlin was through folklore. However, Vivian ended up putting him into an imprisonment, right? And so, putting him in jail or whatever the case, or a magical jail, right? Now, in other stories, it says that she killed him, but in other stories, it says that he was imprisoned in a tree, so on and so forth, etc. And then later on, through two individuals, came back because of, love. Now, this is a lesson that you can take with you, right? Because what happens when a man's heart gets broken, right? He falls into depression, so on and so forth, etc., right? He doesn't know about life anymore. He starts questioning certain things. And I really realized this as I went through my own life, having my own Vivian in my life, two of them, but one personal, one professional. But, it was one of those things where I started to look at the lessons. I started to see exactly what was going on, and I connected the puzzle pieces. Now, what I've been seeing is that a lot of men out there, especially young men coming up in the world, they experience all these things and they're trying to find themselves, right? And when I was a part of a group called Slight Club that was driven mainly by Scott Robinson, he works for Microsoft, I think. It's down in Charlotte. It's right next to the FBI building, so on and so forth, etc. One of the things I noticed was that over time, he softened, right? And it was interesting because when I first started in Slight Club, he was very hard and rigid and this sucks and you got to do this and this, that, and the third. And he was very harsh with his critiquing on the effects and the performance, so on and so forth, not to put you down, but to make you better. However, this also pushed people out of the circle. We had great people like Eric Jones, who's a phenomenal coin magician. Then we had Michael John Hinton, that is now working for Disney, lives out in Texas. We have Caleb, that was on Penn and Teller's Fool Us, along with John, so on and so forth. So it's one of those things, and I don't know if it's Michael John Hinton or John Michael Hinton, one of those. But he's a redhead, has a mohawk type of thing. He was on there as well. And then we have Brian Swearinger, so on and so forth. But over time, and when I came back from the military, I noticed a change in Scott, right? And it was interesting because I saw that change affect Caleb, right? Because he was kind of like his mentor. He was a young male trying to make it in the world, and his approach to critiques was different. Now, how does this, translate over into, well, young men today? Young men today now emulate, whether it be hip hop artists or what they see on TV, or if they see the TV show Power, or if they watch, whatever they're watching at the time, right? And people tend to emulate that, right? And now what happens is, during your discovery process of who you are, who you're trying to become, you make mistakes. And there's nothing wrong with mistakes as long as you discover them early, change, overcome, and adapt. Now, most people now look up to people like Fresh and Fit and Andrew Tate, so on and so forth. But then again, they also try to mimic everything that they're doing. Now, what happens is, because they're not that person, there's a disconnect in how their behavior gets rubbed off on other people. I don't know if you watched the news, but when Andrew Tate blew up, a lot of children were emulating what he was saying back to females, so on and so forth, right? I grew up a little bit differently. Yes, I had that Andrew Tate aspect, right? As far as dressing up, looking nice, occasionally opening my mouth up when I needed to, right? But I also watched things like, well, The Godfather. And then, of course, you had other things like Michael Jackson, Smooth Criminal, where he dressed in a suit, he had the hat, so on and so forth, right? And for my prom, I actually dressed up just like that, right? Very mafioso style, right? As they say. And so I was always taught to be a gentleman. Now, what is a gentleman? Well, if you ever seen, the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, that's one movie, but then Netflix came out and they have the Matthew McConaughey movie, The Gentleman, so on and so forth, etc. But what I've noticed is that growing up and being around different individuals, the ones that have the loudest mouth are normally the weakest people in the room. The ones that have the softer voice, the lower voice, so on and so forth, and speak less normally have the most power in the room. And I saw the same thing happen in the military. So, for instance, when my drill instructor would, lower his voice, I knew we were going to probably be in trouble, or we were getting educated in something, depending on the situation, because you would have to read the room and understand, well, human body language and the context of everything, right? So, yes, sometimes there would be yelling and they would get in your face and do the knife hand and blah, 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 blah. But then at a certain point, the yelling stopped, and then all of a sudden they got lower and lower, and you really started to understand that when the person starts to speak less and gets quiet, that's when things should start, well, you should start paying attention to a lot of things. However, what I've seen now is that there's an extreme difference now, right? There is the group that is extremely loud that puts down the other crowd, so on and so forth. Let's say, for instance, I don't know if you saw my other video where I talked about this young kid wearing glasses. He kind of looked like Harry Potter, and he had a Scarface shirt on, but he was a super nerd and geek, and he's hanging out with all his friends, and we were at Jack in the Box, and as he's walking out of Jack in the Box, he's like, yeah, man, G's up. And I was just like, that kid's going to go somewhere someday. I don't know why, but I thought, to myself, that kid's going to go somewhere someday. Right? Because of the way he carried himself, right? Yeah, he was looking up to all these things. However, it almost reminded me of me when I was a kid, right? I used to look up to all these people, and I used to mimic certain behaviors and everything, but I definitely enjoyed looking classy, right? Why? Because to me, that was, well, dressing smart. If you study the UK or watch any BBC shows, they talk about dressing smart, right? And what is dressing smart? Well, dressing like you, well, belong in the room, right? Not dressing as though you're trying to put on a performance, if that makes sense. They say that, the business owner normally wears jeans and a t-shirt or whatever the hell they want, and then the salespeople would wear the suits and everything else because they're trying to impress somebody. Once you reach a certain level of status, you do not need to impress anybody because people know whom you are. If they don't know whom you are, well, at least dress respectably because people judge a book by its cover. So for you young men out there, dress respectfully. Open the door for the lady, for crying out loud. Be a gentleman, so on and so forth. If you need to use your voice, use it as a tool, not as a way to try to create this bravado or gravitas that's, fictitious, right? I used to listen to, who was it? DMX, right? And DMX would scream and his stuff, and he used to bark and do all these things. However, then I would watch things like Fast and the Furious, and Vin Diesel had a different persona. And then, of course, I saw the movie Pitch Black, and he had a similar persona. But then I would watch Tokyo Drift, and there's a scene in Tokyo Drift where they go into like the Yakuza, so on and so forth, and the uncle or the grandfather of the first DK Drift King, so on and so forth, is sitting there, and he's dressed in a suit, very smooth, so on and so forth, looks like a businessman, looks like he has a pair, so on and so forth, but he speaks very differently, right? He has a very controlled tone. He controls his manner, his emotions, so on and so forth. And so if you're a young person watching this, right, let me ask you a question. When's the last time somebody complimented you for opening the door? When's the last time somebody complimented you on, well, how you behave? When's the last time somebody complimented you and said, you know what, I want my kid to grow up to be like you, right? And that's how you should aspire to be eventually one day, because one day you're going to have children of your own, and, children normally emulate what they see around them, not only in their environment, but what they see between their parents. And, well, let's just face it, if there is something going on in the environment that influences behavior, you could go down one path, right? Watching shows like Power, so on and so forth, thinking you could get away with that, and then you end up in jail or prison, right? Or you could watch other shows, learn from them, so on and so forth, learn from the mistakes, stay out of prison, stay out of jail, right? Become a business owner or become a leader or become a manager, so on and so forth, right? I used to tell this all the time to people. I said, real doctors don't wear white coats, and real police officers or law enforcement normally don't wear a uniform. And a lot of people didn't understand what I was saying until, well, they got in trouble, right? And I would normally try to help people along the way, but because their mind was socially engineered to think as such, they were well groomed, as I would say, right? And then, of course, I would see certain doctors flex their power and ability or their certification or license because they thought that the other individual that they were speaking to was well, naive, and it was going to be incomprehensible when it comes to explaining what it is that they were doing, right? And, that's very interesting because wolves always hide in sheep's clothing, right? But what does that mean? Now, there are good wolves and there are bad wolves, right? This is, let's say, a metaphor and an analogy, right? Just like you have good people and you have bad people. Good people, yes, can do bad things, right? But in the TV show Suits, there was a quote that I would like to say, and it's sometimes the good guys have to do bad things to make the bad guys pay, right? So sometimes the good guys have to be bad, turn into the bad wolf, i.e. go undercover, do whatever the case may be, to make the bad wolves pay or the really bad guys pay, right? Whether that's them dealing with human trafficking, so on and so forth, drugging people. If you've seen the movie Taken with Liam Neeson, remember they took his daughter, and what they did was they drugged her up, so on and so forth, and then they got her used to the drugs and then sold her for sexual favors from people that would pay a lot of money for it, right? Because yes, you can sell drugs once or twice, but a human being you can sell multiple times, right? And this goes for both males and females, right? It was also dictated in the movie The Sound of Freedom that discussed human trafficking and things like that, right? And when you're looking at that, what would you do in that situation, right? Would you step up to the plate, or would you be cowardice, right? Or would you say, it's none of my business, I'm going to stay out of it? Or will you snitch, right? Because you're getting paid or you're getting tipped for whatever, so on and so forth, right? Remember, during COVID and things like that, people were getting checks and they were getting payments for snitching on their neighbors, right? For certain things. So money talks. Remember that. So what you have to realize is you have to look at your own morals, your own ethics, your own values, right? And how you conduct and carry yourself. Because at the end of the day, you have to remember we're dealing with fiat currency, meaning it's fake. It's not backed by anything, right? It's not backed by gold. It's not backed by silver, so on and so forth. At least here it's not. So is it really worth it, right? Are you willing to risk? Yes, you can have flexible morals and ethics, but are you willing to risk your values, your morals, your ethics to either get back at somebody or to, trade them for money or to, they may have rubbed you the wrong way, so on and so forth. So you're going to cause harm to them. If you remember my story about the doctor that ended up taking out his anger on me and ended up causing a herniated disc, and he did not do his due diligence, that was from the Joint Chiropractic out in Valentine, North Carolina. Granted, I wanted to do a lot of things to this individual. All he did was expose himself for who he was. Now, that told me a lot. That told me, one, I needed to get out of the area because it was probably a bad area to be in the first place, because it was probably corrupted. Right. Two, he's more than willing to put in danger his patients based upon his emotional being. Right. If he hears a story that some woman tells him and then takes that anger out on the individual without understanding the facts or asking questions, well, that tells me a couple things. Was he into this person? Was he willing to do stuff for this person? If so, what was their connection? What was the, appeal that made him want to do such a thing? And so when things like that happen, you could go about it a couple ways. You could go about it like we do in the street sometimes, or like we do in the Marines, where you drop blouse, you beat the hell out of the person, you get them to understand that they should probably never do that again. Or you could take out a class action and attempt to go that way, unless there's more corruption that's involved, which just tells you exactly what you're dealing with and how big it is, so on and so forth. But then it tells you a lot about the business and the business owner. Because if the business owner of the franchise does not care and they only care about the profit, so on and so forth, well, karma's a bitch, and karma will come back to bite you in the ass. And you can say, this, that, and the third, but, I've experienced it, and I know several people that have experienced karma, right? Do unto others as you shall have them do unto you. It's the golden rule for a reason, right? So think about that, right? Treat others how you want to be treated. If you're raising your voice at somebody, if you're stating something, make sure you understand it fully before you respond. Remember, Stephen Covey once said in the book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, most people listen to respond. Most leaders listen to understand. So I want you guys to go ahead and, take this in, right? Go ahead and study books, so on and so forth, whether they're fact, whether they're fictional, so on and so forth, nonfiction, whether they're documentaries, etc., and learn lessons from them, and then incorporate them into your life, creating new patterns, right? This is how you get creativity, right? You only get creativity out of, the discovery of something else, right? Now that we have AI, people are able to be more creative and discover and ask questions to things like ChatGPT and Google's Gemini, Claude, Perplexity, Midjourney, and all these other platforms that do AI. So how can I make an image that looks like this, and then have the AI walk you through it? How can I go ahead and write a better paper? Go ahead and have AI assist you with that, but don't have AI write the whole thing for you. Put some actual effort into it. It may come up with a rough draft, but AI is smart enough to put things in there so that it tells individuals if it was its original work or not. So think about that. Maybe use it to go ahead and replan your life, right? I'm starting this, I want to go back to school, or I'm going to school. How can I, set a plan or a strategy and put one in place so that, my life could be better, right? So that, if you have a family, if you want to have, a business, if you want to, be a professional in the field, you can be extremely successful at it. So, hope you guys learned this lesson, took it with a grain of salt, as I always say. And till the next episode, my friends, take care, have a great day. This has been another episode of Finding Freedom. Peace.